Marshall amplification is one of the most popular, successful brands of all time. Marshall amps have been used by everyone from the most iconic guitar players in history to weekend warriors and bedroom shredders. Marshall amps use valve technology, and Marshall offers many modern options such as solid state, hybrid, and even modeling amps. With a history as rich as its tones, the Marshall story is a fascinating one. Let's get into it. The company namesake, Jim Marshall, had been playing music for more than 20 years when he opened Jim Marshall and Son. Jim and his son Terry Marshall opened their doors in July 1960 in Hanwell, England. Eventually, the store changed its name to J&T Marshall and opened a second location across the street. The store's selection appealed to guitarists including Ritchie Blackmore and Pete Townshend. The shop became a trendy place for young musicians getting into the rock scene, and soon the store became one of the area's top sellers of guitar amplifiers. After hearing several guitarists complain that they couldn't get the sound in their head to come through their current speakers, Jim Marshall decided to build his own. When Jim Marshall designed his first amplifier in 1962, he used the 12AX7 vacuum tube, a slight deviation from the 12AY7 tubes of the popular Fender amps, because Marshall couldn't find any in Britain at the time. This meant that customers of his amps suddenly had a little more crunch in their guitar sound. Jim worked with his son Terry, with whom he co-owned the shop, as well as engineer Ken Brand. They designed circuits and components to create something the world had never heard before. Interesting factoid here is that none of them were actually guitar players. Jim had been a touring drummer, while Terry was a saxophone player, and Ken Brand was a former Pan Am aircraft engineer. Named number one, the first Marshall amp received 23 orders on its first day of sale in 1962. It would later be renamed the JTM 45. From the beginning, Marshall rated its amps by RMS, root mean square, which is where the 45 comes in, where other manufacturers rated their designs in terms of peak power. JTM 45, it had two independent channels. Channel 1 had 6 dB more gain than Channel 2. However, it would be 15 years before Marshall built in channel switching. The low wattage speakers of the era meant the amp needed at least 4 of them, giving rise to the first Marshall cabinet design, closed back with 4 20-watt G12 Alnico speakers made by London-based Celestion. This stood in contrast to the Jensen speakers found in open-backed Fender Bassman 410s. Eric Clapton was an early adopter of Marshall amps, using them first with the Yardbirds and later with John Mayall. The particular amp Clapton used on the Blues Breakers' John Mayall with Eric Clapton album, model 1962, the first Marshall combo. It became something of an icon, forever known as Blues Breaker Combo. The Blues Breaker helped define the sound of 1960s blues rock, especially in Europe. It was November 1965 when Clapton came back, ampless and poor, to start his second stint with the Blues Breakers. That's when he purchased the iconic 212 combo from Jim's shop. In 1966, Marshall began building their already respected brand with more powerful amps and several cosmetic changes. More models started to sport the iconic script Marshall logo we now see today, and a new line of 50-watt amps took the market by storm. In search of more power, Pete Townshend of The Who let Jim know 50 watts was not going to be enough. In his words, he needed a sonic weapon, a mandate that led Marshall and his team on a quest to build an unprecedented 100-watt amp. To complement the unprecedented wattage of the new 100-watt head, Townshend asked for a single cabinet with 8 12-inch speakers. Jim told Pete that such behemoths would be a roadie's nightmare and suggested stacking 2 412s. Townshend refused. So initially, they built 6 of the cabinets, 2 for Townshend, 2 for John Entwistle, and 2 went to the Small Faces. It wasn't long before roadies had quit, and Pete Townshend came back and asked Jim Marshall to cut it in half, as a single 8x12 cab proved impossible for anyone's road crew. What resulted was the first Marshall stack, with a 100-watt head placed atop two 412 cabs, and a legend was born. The word Plexi is often used in reference to early Marshall amps. The term, however, doesn't officially refer to any one specific Marshall model. It merely refers to the acrylic plastic material, plexiglass, the company often used for its front and back faceplates from 1965 to 1969. Over the years, the phrase Marshall Plexi became most affiliated with the Super Lead, model number 1959, an updated 100-watt design introduced in late spring of 1967 that evolved through 1969. By the time the JMP came around, there had been further changes to Marshall's manufacturing practices. These models now offered a master volume in order to bring it to a more reasonable level. Marshall changed how the signal flowed within the amps to keep the characteristic crunch that formed the basis of so many guitar players' sound. Players soon found that cranking the new master volume could provide even more saturation. JMPs found favor with popular guitar players such as Slash, Zakk Wylde, and Randy Rhoads. One of Marshall's most popular models, the JCM 800, was launched in the early 80s. This one was a much different style, designed to produce more overdrive directly into distortion. It was also cheaper than past Marshall amps, which meant up-and-coming artists were better able to afford it. As Marshall celebrated 25 years in the market, it released the Silver Jubilee in 1987. The 1990s saw the release of the DSL and JVM lines, which offered multiple channels and features that were a culmination of everything that had come before them. While these models haven't stood the test of time, quite like the Plexi and JCM 800, they still offer all the crunch that players have always found so appealing. I want to thank everybody for joining me on this interesting history of Marshall. This has been Damon D. One World, One Rock.